So you probably clicked on this video because you want to know how to use a real camera, not just your iPhone. Or you're a little bit more experienced and you just want a review. Either way, by the end of this video, you're going to know how to use a DSLR or mirrorless camera to shoot high quality photos and videos. If you're new around here, my name is Sam. I'm a videographer and photographer here on YouTube and also on Instagram. So if you do like my content, make sure you subscribe and follow me over on Instagram. So in this video, I'm just going to run through some of the basic settings that you need to know in order to successfully operate your camera setup. So without any further ado, let's get into the video. So the first thing you want to do when you are setting up your camera is your exposure, which is how bright or how dark your image is. So if you're shooting on a bright day, you want to make your settings darker to compensate for that, and then vice versa if you're shooting in a dark space. So each of these settings has its own unique benefits and drawbacks, and something my photography teacher used to say is that it's like a balancing act. So you have to sacrifice some things in order to achieve other results. So the first exposure setting that you want to set is your shutter speed, which controls how fast or slow the shutter in your camera opens to let in light. So if you have a slower shutter speed, typically between 1/60th of a second and slower to something like 30 seconds long, you're going to be letting more light into your camera because your shutter is going to be open for longer. However, when you do this, you're going to have more motion blur in your image, which is not ideal for something like action photography. For shooting video, you want to make sure that your shutter speed is double your frame rate. So if you're shooting 24 frames per second in your video, you want your shutter speed to be 1/48 of a second. If you're shooting 60 frames, you want it to be 1/120, and so on for different frame rates. And this gives your video the most natural looking motion blur, most similar to what your eye sees in real life. Once you start cranking that shutter speed a little bit and making it faster, such as 1/1000th of a second, you will be letting less light into your camera sensor, hence it will make the image darker. When you're using a high shutter speed, it is ideal for something like action photography, which will give you the effect that you are freezing a moment in time. But for video, if you're cranking that shutter a little bit too high, it's going to make your images look a little bit more jittery. Sometimes this is a stylistic choice if you want to do a high-paced action sequence in your videos, but I would typically recommend to do the 180-degree shutter rule, which is keeping your shutter speed double your frame rate. Now the next exposure setting we're going to be talking about is aperture, and this is probably my favorite exposure setting to change. This is also a feature that lets light in or cuts light out, but it is a function of your camera's lens rather than the camera itself, like the shutter speed. And this works because there is a feature within your camera's lens called the iris, which can open up to let more light in or close down to cut out more light. And depending on your camera's lens, you're going to have a different minimum aperture. So what you need to know for this is that when you have your aperture set to a lower number, say f2.8 for example, you're going to be letting more light into the camera sensor. And when you also do this, you're going to be experiencing something called depth of field. Now this is the background blur that you see in your camera, which is typically a feature of higher quality productions. So when I set my exposure, I tend to put it at the lowest possible aperture, but sometimes that's not possible depending on the lighting conditions you're shooting in. Now if we raise that aperture up to something like f16, we are going to be making the image darker, but also more of the image is going to be in focus. So this is ideal for when you're shooting something like landscapes or just anything in general where you want more of the image in focus. Typically a rule of thumb is if you want a shallower depth of field, you want to go for an aperture like f2.8 or lower. If you want to have more of your image in focus and hence less depth of field, you want to have your aperture at something like f8 or higher. The last exposure setting is ISO, which controls your camera's sensitivity to light. If your ISO number is lower, something like ISO 100, your camera is going to be less sensitive to light and therefore it will create a darker image. If you raise that ISO number a little bit higher to something like ISO 1000, you'll be making your image brighter because your camera is going to be more sensitive to light. But the problem with doing this is as you raise that ISO, your camera is going to have more grain in the image, and sometimes that image will fall apart depending on how high your ISO is. So you gotta be careful with how high you are pumping your ISO. Now the key to look out for when setting your exposure and making sure you have the correct exposure is checking your light meter. Now on some cameras it is like a number line. On cameras like mine, It is simply a plus or minus value telling you how bright or dark your image is. Anything that is a negative number means your image is underexposed or too dark, and anything that is a positive number means that your image is overexposed and too bright. So the sweet spot where you want to sit for your light meter is plus or minus 0. So you need to be careful when using your light meter though, because when you are pointing your camera at different things, your light meter is going to read something different. So make sure you are pointing your camera at your scene when you are setting your exposure in order to make sure that your light meter has the most accurate reading. Once you have your exposure dialed in, there are a few other settings that you need to keep in mind when shooting photo and video. The first is white balance, which is a measure of how warm or how cold your image is. This is also called color temperature, which is measured with the letter K, which stands for Kelvin. Basically, the higher your Kelvin number, the warmer your image is, which means your image is going to be more orange in color. And the lower your Kelvin number is, the colder your image is going to be, so it's going to look more blue. Ideally, it is best to have something white in your frame to see how accurate the white balance in your camera is, if it's too warm or too cold. But sometimes you can just eyeball it and see if you think your image is too orange or too blue. Most cameras have preset values for white balance, like daylight or cloudy, for when you're shooting in those conditions. And sometimes you can also use auto white balance. However, I wouldn't really recommend using auto white balance, especially for video, because sometimes you might have little color shifts throughout your scene. Next is focus mode, which comes in two options, either autofocus or manual focus. Autofocus is when your camera automatically finds the subject in your frame and focuses on that. And most cameras these days are pretty fast and accurate with that. So right now we are shooting in autofocus, and so far we haven't lost focus on my face. That's because this camera is very good at tracking where my face is in the frame. This is also helpful when you're shooting photos, because when you have fast moving subjects, you can't set your focus all the time. There are also different types of autofocus, but I won't get into that in today's video. If you want to see that in a future video, leave a comment down below and I will do that. Manual focus is just when you are setting focus on your subject yourself. And this is beneficial sometimes when you have foreground in front of your subject, like a bush or a tree or something like that. And usually you set the manual focus by rotating the ring on your camera's lens to your liking. I use both of these focus modes in day-to-day shooting, and they have their specific scenarios that they thrive in, and you will kind of find this out as you start shooting more. Now, when you're shooting video, there is another setting you want to keep in mind, and that is your video resolution and frame rate. Your resolution is basically just how many pixels are in your image. So if you're shooting at a higher resolution like 4K or 1080p, you are going to get a clearer image because there's more pixels. Your frame rate is how many frames your camera is capturing in 1 second of video, which is measured in FPS, stands for frames per second. The standard frame rate for professional situations is 24 frames per second, which most accurately depicts the way that our eyes see real time. However, if you want to use slow motion, you would set your camera to a higher frame rate, like 60 frames per second or 120 frames per second, depending on how slow you want to make it in your post-production. Just keep in mind though that when you're shooting at higher resolutions and higher frame rates, the storage on your camera's SD card is going to fill up faster. Now, when you are shooting photos, you typically are going to choose between two different file formats, and that is RAW and JPEG. RAW is a file format that gives you a little bit more flexibility when you are editing your photo, because in that RAW file, you are getting more information from your camera. And JPEG is just a more compressed file format that you can't do too much with in editing, but it's going to take up less space on your camera's SD card. Even though RAW does take up more space on your camera's memory card, I would suggest shooting it in pretty much every scenario when you can, because you are going to get that extra flexibility when you are editing. The next setting is picture profile, which is more important if you're shooting videos than photos. For photos, you would probably just leave your camera on its standard picture profile setting, which will give you accurate contrast and saturation in your image. But when you're shooting video, a lot of videographers like myself tend to shoot in something called a log profile. Now, a log profile spits out more of a desaturated and low contrast image in an effort to preserve the information in the brightest parts and the darkest parts of your image. This does take some work when you're editing though, so if you are just a beginner videographer and you don't want to do too much correction to your video, I would say just shoot in your standard picture profile or something that is like a neutral or HLG profile. And lastly, we have audio record level, which is basically just a measurement of how loud or quiet your camera is capturing audio. Obviously, you only need to touch this setting if you're recording somebody speaking or you need to have the audio in your scene. You want to set your record levels so that your audio is at its loudest between -6 and -12 decibels. This means that your audio won't peak or sound distorted. So have your subject speak in order to capture audio levels before you hit record. So cameras are only half of the equation when you're shooting photos and videos. Lenses are the other half. And the lens is arguably the more important part of your camera setup because it gives you a specific look in your image. Now I could talk about lenses for a while, so I'll just give you a brief explanation in this video. Now lenses are defined by something called a focal length. And basically, depending on that focal length, your lens will be wider or tighter. Wide angle lenses have focal lengths ranging from around 10 millimeters to 35 millimeters. Mid-range lenses range from about 35 to 70 millimeters, and telephoto lenses go from about 70 millimeters and upwards. Lenses also have different minimum apertures like I mentioned earlier in the video, and based on that minimum aperture, the lens might have a better depth of field than others. There are also two classifications of lenses that are zoom lenses, which cover a wide range of focal lengths, or prime lenses, which are just one specific focal length. There are also other differences between the zoom lenses and prime lenses, but that's a topic for a different video. So that's all you need to know about the basics of setting up your camera for photo and video. Make sure you like this video and comment if you found it helpful. Also let me know if you want to see more types of videos like this and I'll be sure to make them. Go ahead and hit subscribe if you want to, it helps me out a lot. And follow me on Instagram too, because that's cool. Anyway, thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.